All right, so let's get into it this time with the Menendez brothers case. Back in '89, this thing was everywhere you look. It was on the news, a Beverly Hills mansion, a shocking double murder, and the sons Lyle and Erik right there at the center of it. Now it's 2025, and this case is back in a big way. We've got new evidence, a new DA, someone with a very different way of doing things, and the family is fighting harder than ever to get the brothers out.
I think what's so interesting here is that this case isn't really about guilt or innocence anymore. It's about how our whole idea of justice has changed, especially when we're talking about abuse. And, what it really means to rehabilitate someone after they've committed a serious crime.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're taking this deep dive into all these articles. I mean, we've got everything. Legal analyses, emotional pleas from the family. It's a lot to go through. But no matter if you've been following this case from the beginning or you're just now catching up, get ready for some surprises.
You're right, this case is far from simple. To really get what's happening now, we need to go back to 1989, when Jose and Kitty Menendez were found murdered in their Beverly Hills home. And everyone immediately suspected their sons, Lyle and Erik. The media painted this picture of these spoiled rich kids who did it for the money, but then the defense threw everyone a curveball.
Oh, yeah, the brothers said they acted in self-defense, that they had been abused for years by their father. I mean, that totally changed things. Public opinion really started to shift.
It definitely did. And the first trials, they had separate ones for each brother, ended up with hung juries. Then they had retrials, where they didn't allow a lot of the evidence about the abuse. And that's when they were convicted and sentenced to life without parole. But that question of abuse never went away. And now, all these years later, it's the main issue again.
This is where it gets interesting. There's a letter from Erik to his cousin Anby that supposedly talks about the abuse. This letter's from 1988. And it was never shown in the original trials. Now people are questioning if it's real, but it's definitely got people talking.
And to make things even more complicated, there's Roy Russillo. He used to be in Menudo. And he's saying that he was also abused by Jose Menendez. Now that someone else is backing up the brother's story, it makes us look at Jose in a whole new light.
This case was already a mess, and now it's about to get even more tangled. There's a new DA in town, Nathan Hochman. He was elected because he promised to be tough on crime. And he replaced George Gascon, who was seen as more lenient. So what does this mean for the brothers' chances of being released?
Well, it's a big change. You see, Gascon was actually the one who started the process of maybe resentencing the brothers, which could have led to parole, but Hochman is much stricter. He's already said publicly that he's against a new trial based on this so-called evidence.
So he doesn't believe the letter, or what Russell is saying?
He's skeptical, to say the least. He doesn't think the letter is real, and he says it shouldn't have come out so late. He basically says, even if the abuse was real, it doesn't make murder okay. He's saying, look, they still committed murder.
That's a tough stance. It seems like he's making it clear what his priorities are as DA. But I'm curious about this tough-on-crime approach. How does that fit in with all the talk about changing the justice system? These days, a lot of people are realizing how much trauma matters. And they're pushing for rehabilitation, even for people who committed serious crimes.
Yeah, that's an interesting conflict, isn't it? Seems like Hochman's view is more traditional, like punishment is the goal. But at the same time, he's got this case where the crime itself brings up all these questions about abuse, trauma, and when self-defense is justified.
So we've got this new DA, wants to be tough on crime, but he's also got this case that's full of gray areas, abuse, self-defense. And then the whole question of, can people really change after doing something terrible? What happens next?
Okay, well, here's where it gets interesting. Hochman doesn't want a new trial because of the new evidence, but he is looking at that resentencing request, the one his predecessor started. So that means he's digging into the brothers' behavior in prison, their rehabilitation efforts, and, whether they could actually function in society again.
Okay, so that's where things get complicated. You've got Hochman trying to be Mr. Law and Order, but he also have to consider whether these men who committed this awful crime, have they really changed after all these years in prison?
Exactly. And from what I'm reading in these articles, it doesn't sound like Lyle and Erik have just been sitting around doing nothing. They've been participating in all sorts of programs. They've even started some of their own to help other inmates who experienced trauma as kids. And they've been involved in providing care for prisoners who are disabled or elderly.
So they're actually trying to do good, to make up for what they did, and better themselves. That seems like something a parole board would look at favorably.
It could. Gascon, the DA, before Hochman even called them model prisoners, but whether that'll be enough for Hochman, who knows? He really wants to keep those campaign promises and reopening this case, and maybe even letting them go free. Some people would see that as going back on his word.
He's really stuck between a rock and a hard place, and then you've got the media going crazy about this case. The Menendez brothers have always been a big story, and now with all these new documentaries and that Netflix series, Everyone's paying attention again.
Yeah, that's a good point. All that media attention just makes things more complicated. Public opinion has a lot of power, and it's hard to say how much it could sway Hochman. Some people are already saying he's just playing politics with this, especially since he's doing the exact opposite of what his predecessor did.
It's wild, isn't it? This case isn't just about one family's tragedy anymore. It's become this symbol for all these bigger debates we're having about our justice system. You know how we deal with accusations of abuse? And whether people who do horrible things deserve a second chance?
Absolutely, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just looking at the facts of what happened, we're looking at the values and beliefs that shape our whole justice system. It makes you think, what would you do if you were Hochman? How do you balance holding someone accountable with the possibility that they could actually change?
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of people are struggling with, especially with all this new information coming out. It makes you look at your own biases, your own sense of right and wrong, and think about what justice really means.
And it shows you just how much power a DA has. Hochman's decision about whether to resentence them, that could have huge implications, not just for the Menendez brothers, but for how similar cases are handled in the future.
So let's say, just hypothetically, Hochman recommends resentencing, the judge agrees, and the brothers are eligible for parole. Then what? These are men who've been locked up for over 30 years. Can they really come back into society after all that time?
That's the big question, isn't it? And that's something the parole board would have to really think about. They'd have to figure out if the brothers are still a danger to the public, what their mental state is like, if they have people to support them, and basically, are they ready to be part of a world that's completely different from the one they left?
It's a huge position, and you can't forget about how all of this has affected everyone involved. The Menendez family, the people who loved the victims, the jurors, the lawyers. This tragedy has had a huge impact on all of them. And now, all these years later, they have to deal with it all again.
Yeah, this case isn't just about legal definitions of guilt or innocence. It's about people and how they can do terrible things, but also maybe change in a profound way. It's a story that's still going. And every year, it seems like there's a new layer of complexity.
Man, there's a lot to think about here, isn't there? This case has been going on for decades. So many debates. And it really makes you think about some uncomfortable stuff about how our justice system works.
You know, one thing that really stands out to me is how differently we think about trauma and abuse now. Back in the 80s and 90s, the idea that men could be victims of abuse, especially from their own father, was like nobody wanted to talk about it. It was taboo.
Right. It wasn't something people really acknowledged. And you can see how that affected how people saw the Menendez brothers case back then. The focus was all on the crime itself, how brutal it was, and how these two guys from a rich family just wanted money. The abuse claims were kind of brushed aside.
Thankfully, we talk about abuse more openly now. We're realizing how common it is and how much it can hurt people long term. And that change is affecting the legal system, too. Now there's more focus on understanding trauma and how past abuse can explain why someone might commit a crime.
Which brings us right back to the Menendez brothers and how things might turn out differently for them this time. It's pretty interesting how their case is kind of at the center of all this change.
It really is, and no matter what Hochman decides about the resentencing, this case is going to keep people talking. It makes us ask some tough questions, like can we as a society recognize how awful abuse is and still hold people responsible for what they do? Can someone who's done something so violent ever really redeem themselves? What does justice even mean in a case this messed up?
Those are tough questions, and I think that's part of why this case is so fascinating. It makes us really think, to examine what we believe, and have real discussions about what's important to us as a society.
We've been going through all these articles, but this is just the beginning. There's so much more information out there. Court transcripts, interviews, documentaries, expert opinions, all kinds of stuff that can give us even more insights.
Exactly. And to everyone listening, if you really want to understand this case, we encourage you to do your own research, come to your own conclusions, and join the conversation about this important case.
The Menendez brothers' story shows us that justice isn't always simple. It's a complicated idea that keeps changing, shaped by social norms, legal precedents, and what we learn about how people behave. And sometimes the hardest cases are the ones that make us look at our own biases and really think about forgiveness, accountability, and second chances.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with this thought. Imagine you're on the parole board. You've seen all the evidence. You've heard everyone's side of the story. What would you decide? Would you let the Menendez brothers out after all this time? It's a question people will keep debating, and one that we all have to answer for ourselves.